Welcome to Chapter 8.3 of U.S. History, The New Nation. This is about the first administration. Well, after the new Constitution had been ratified by the Continental Congress, they began to have elections for the first president in the spring of 1789. The new government was going to have a temporary capital in New York City, and Washington's inauguration on April 30th of 1789 was held on the balcony of Federal Hall, which is on the corner of Wall Street and Broad Street, which I have actually been to. How exciting. These first few years of the new government were very crucial to the development of America as a nation. It was going to create the precedents that the United States would follow. It cannot really be said that Washington was a man of the people. He had fine tastes, and he liked to show his superiority. He would often be seen riding around the town with a huge carriage and 6 horses drawing it, and escorted by uniformed liverymen. The idea of dressing the Congress in person was a precedent that General George Washington created, and he also set up the precedent of seeking advice from the Senate. The Congress also began setting up different departments, and so General Washington, or President Washington, appointed several of the founding fathers to be the secretaries of State and Treasury and War. And so he ended up choosing Thomas Jefferson to be the Secretary of State, and that meant that Jefferson had to travel a lot as the representative of the United States. Alexander Hamilton became the Secretary of Treasury, and he ended up creating the National Bank, which saved the United States from bankruptcy. Henry Knox was the Secretary of War, and Edmund Randolph was the Secretary of Justice. These men often had differing opinions about how things should be run, but Washington was always a mediator. He always became a peacemaker between these men and made decisions on his own judgments rather than necessarily on their judgments. Again, the Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson. Secretary of Treasury was Alexander Hamilton. The Secretary of War was Henry Knox, and Edmund Randolph was the Justice Department and the Attorney General. So he was the Secretary of Justice. Probably one of the most important pieces of legislation that was passed during these early years was an act called the Judiciary Act of 1789. And this act set up basically the powers of the judiciary branch. This act decided about the number of justices that the Supreme Court would have, and it also gave the courts the power to create a federal court system. It established a high court of 6 justices, which eventually it was increased to 9 justices in 1869, and it established 3 circuit justice courts. So that meant that these judges would travel through the country and hear cases and then make decisions. And then it also created 13 districts, which there still are 13 districts. The main arguments were against this were based on the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists wanted to see a more unified system of law, code, and courts, etc. And the Anti-Federalists wanted a more localized law system. And so there was kind of a compromise between the two. They limited the jurisdiction of the federal courts. That means the federal courts could not try cases that the state courts should try. And then in return, the federal courts got the power of judicial review, which means that if a case, the person who has had the case feels like they have had injustice done, they can appeal to a higher court, and that higher court would be the federal courts. So this they call the federal courts are the appellate courts, which is the appeal to the higher court. So, and then you can appeal something all the way to the Supreme Court for only very few reasons. One of the main reasons would be that it was unconstitutional, but you have to be able to prove that something unconstitutional happened. The main concern of the states was that they would lose their practice of common law. So they had been creating law systems based on precedent, or what had been done before that. Well, actually, what the English law had done before. So most of the laws that were enacted in the states were actually English. Because of the concept of judicial review, federal courts became appellate courts. That means that the power of the court was to decide whether decisions that had already been made by other courts were constitutional or not. One incident that kind of shed light on this whole issue was the case between Chisholm and Georgia in 1793. It ruled in favor of two South Carolina residents who had sued the state of Georgia for the recovery of confiscated property. But the court overthrew the common law principle that the sovereignty could not be sued without its consent, and so it supported the two claimants' arguments, and they won the case. This is something that the localists, those who argued against having a unified federal system of justice, they were very afraid of this happening, and so they supported something called they supported the 11th Amendment, which declared that no state could be sued by a citizen from another state. But the Supreme Court nevertheless established itself as the final authority on the questions of law when it was between two states or an individual and a state. The national debt by this time was huge and looming ever larger. So something needed to be done. The Congress passed a tariff in 1789 on imports, and it was to try to protect imports protect the manufacturing that was being done within the United States. So it made imports more expensive than products that were being made within the country. At this point, duties on imports and rather than direct taxes on property or income was what made most of the federal income. In 1790, the Treasury Secretary Hamilton submitted a series of reports on the nation's economic future. He created an amazing piece that had a whole bunch of ideas that wrapped the financial station of the United States up also in the idea of federalism. So he created a unified system where federalism would help to solve the country's financial problems. He recommended in his piece that the federal government should assume all of the state's debts for the past 15 years and make it all one national debt. And then to raise the revenue for that debt, he recommended that they have an excise tax on the manufacture of alcohol or liquor. Well, the Congress eventually decided to take on this plan and they paid off over $11 million that they owed to foreign creditors. But they still had a domestic debt of about $27 million that was owed to people within the United States. This internal debt was owed often to people who had supported the revolution with their money and had bought bonds in the government and then had kept those bonds, hoping that someday they would be able to redeem those bonds. But because of their financial difficulties, they'd had to sell them to speculators who had come along and said, well, we will pay like 10 cents of what that's actually worth, and we'll pay that to you, and you'll get a guaranteed payment rather than waiting and seeing if the government will actually pay you back years later. So they ended up taking that deal, although it really wasn't a deal. And so speculators were getting huge amounts of money during this time on bonds that had been sold to them for very little. And the many founding fathers and other people thought that this was an immoral thing, and that the United States should not support these guys who had done things that were, I mean, legally not wrong, but morally was very wrong. But Hamilton insisted that this was the only way that they could really solidify the United States' economic future. They finally came to an agreement that if they put they tied the decision to the placement of the capital. One of the problems with Hamilton's idea of a central bank, or the economic system that he was presenting, was that it caused a lot of power to be put in the hands of the centralized government. And this went against the anti-federalists' ideal that there should be less power in the central government. And so this debate eventually got so heated that they had to come to a compromise at some point, and they decided that it would be over where the capital would be placed. Northern congressmen agreed to locate the new federal district on the boundary between Virginia and Maryland, and that changed the capital from the temporary New York or Philadelphia to the swampy area that became known as the District of Columbia. And this move happened in 1800. But 2 weeks later, they also adopted Hamilton's credit program as the other side of that compromise. By the middle of the 1790s, Jefferson was representing the anti-federalists, and the majority of them were Southern planters, and Hamilton, who spoke for the Federalists, who the majority of them were New Englanders and Northern capitalists, and they began a feud, basically, in the government. The beginnings of the party system were very stressful for Washington. He did not like to see such divisions in his political program, and it also really disturbed John Adams as well. During this time, the French Revolution was going on. The French were hoping that the Americans would support them in their revolution, just as the French had supported the Americans. But it was almost impossible for the Americans to think of supporting the French at this time, because they didn't have the resources to do that. And so they ended up choosing a line of neutrality. Internally, though, there were two contrasting perspectives on what they should do. Hamilton and the Federalists believed that it was necessary to maintain a trading relationship with Great Britain, and that would mean not joining the French. Jefferson and Madison and other anti-federalists, who are now being called Democrats, were opposed to having any kind of union with their traditional enemies, the British, and so they wanted to join the French. Not only that, but Jefferson was an avid Francophile, meaning that he appreciated the French and wanted to support them personally, and he felt like the United States should do that also. One incident that helped to change the minds of many people in the federal government was the incident of Citizen Genet, who came over from France as an ambassador to the United States to try to gain support for the French Revolution. He came in 1793, and he was greeted by huge crowds of supporters. But as it became clear that Washington was not going to support him financially or politically, he became belligerent and almost violent in his denunciation of the Americans as being false friends, etc., etc. But the ironic thing is that Citizen Genet when his appointment was finished and he was supposed to go back to France, he actually never did. He ran away to the west of the United States and lived the rest of his life there. I think he was afraid that if he went back to France, he would be killed by the guillotine. After the Revolutionary War, the Indians who had sided with the British didn't feel like they had surrendered, even though the British had. And so they had a difficult time coming to terms with the new American government and leadership. And so this caused a lot of conflict. And the United States did some things that were a little bit of a bipolar, I guess you could say, because they approached the problem as wanting to help the Indians as much as possible and get them to learn how to read and to fit into society and all that kind of thing. But they also wanted to take all their land from them. So the Indians were not stupid and knew exactly what was going on, and they did not do it willingly or quietly. They went out with a lot of anger. But I think all that rhetoric was mostly to help the Americans feel like they hadn't done anything really bad. So things that they would say were, for example, the utmost good faith shall always be observed towards the Indians. The one ordinance of 1787 read that their lands and property shall never be taken from them without their consent. Well, I guess technically that was true because they always signed treaties, but the treaties were never fair and often were coerced. The inconsistent law that was first passed in regards to the treatment of the Indians by the Congress was called the Intercourse Act of 1790, and it was an act to try to regulate the communication and exchange with the Indian tribes. They were trying to eliminate a lot of the unscrupulous trading and abuse that was happening by American settlers in the Indian lands, but it ended up being not really effective enough. They tried to create a licensing system to help make some the traders that they felt were trustworthy were licensed by the government. The act declared that public treaties between the United States and the Indian nations was the only legal means by which you could obtain Indian land. But the reality was that the government was really unable to control the flood of settlers that were coming down the Ohio River. One Army officer wrote that they carried on private expeditions against the Indians and killed them whenever they could. And he added that there was not even a single jury in the West that would dare to punish a man for those kind of crimes. American settlers were migrating towards the West all throughout the American Revolution, and they went into the areas known as Ohio and Illinois and Wisconsin and Michigan and all those territories that are in the central and northern areas of the United States. In defense of their homes, villages of Shawnee, Delaware, and other Indian peoples tried to join together under a chief named Little Turtle in the fall of 1790. Little Turtle was a very clever warrior and often would lure federal forces into traps or strongholds and then hurt them. And in November 1791, the Confederation the Indian Confederation inflicted such a disastrous defeat on a large American force under General Arthur St. Clair, who was a governor of the Northwest Territories, that more than 900 Americans were killed or wounded. A special investigative committee came from East and found that St. Clair was incompetent, or his leadership was incompetent. But really what the point was that the Americans were not willing to admit the contradiction of their words and their actions. They were speaking words of peace and harmony with the Indians, but their actions showed differently.